welcome to the webinar. I'd like to thank you for taking the time into your day to show up. So the name of the webinar is, are you an Agile project manager or an Agile project leader, and why does the question matter? It's kind of an interesting thing, and I hope you find through the course of the presentation that I'm able to answer that question as to what it is and also why it matters. BSS Nexus Global is the CTC Train Canada Agile training partner, Agile Scrum training partner. So all of our courses are currently listed on both websites for CTC or CTE rather, and for CTC Train Canada. At the back of the presentation, there's a list of upcoming courses, so please do check them out. If you go on the website and you don't see something that you're actually looking for, by all means, you can talk to one of your CTE representatives, and we'd be happy to take it under advisement, and perhaps it's something that we could offer. So with that, I'll get started into the presentation. So I'm going to skip over the part about me, seeing as we're running a little bit behind. The only thing I'll say about this one is that as we're starting to learn new things or new ways of doing things that apply to jobs we already have, one of the challenges we have is that how we currently do things may not exactly be how we need to do things in the future. So in that sense, it's why I say experience can be an encumbrance to learning. And as the wise Yoda would say, we must unlearn what we have learned if we're going to move forward. So here's what we're going to talk about. We'll try and answer the question of what's agility by looking at the different types of agility, and there's more than one. We'll talk about what's Agile project leadership, seeing as I'm obviously drawing a distinction between Agile project management and Agile project leadership, and how do you become an Agile project leader. So this one here, why do organizations spend? Interestingly, the vast majority of the money that organizations do spend is spent on running the business. That's kind of an obvious thing. But at the same time, one of the things that's come out through various studies and such is that putting too much of your actual spend into running the business in the long run is actually not a good thing. You need to spend a lot more than most currently do on growing the business and transforming the business. So how do you do that? Well, and this sort of gets into the different types of agility. So if you ask people about agility in an organizational sense, they'll typically talk about organizational agility or business agility. And there's actually quite a few more, as you can see here. Business agility, the way we define it, is actually more focused on the business operations side, which I'll come back to in a few minutes. Strategic agility is being able to establish a strategic vision of where you feel you want to go and some of the things you need to do to get there, but being willing as you move along on the path to achieving that vision of being willing to adapt to what you're actually encountering and finding, and being willing to make adjustments, both in the vision, some of the objectives, and so on. Strategic agility or strategic objectives, strategic priorities are kind of help us figure out what we should do. And these kind of also, the priorities are why we should do something. So what outcomes do we expect to get if we achieve that objective or that goal? And this is where value agility comes in, because value agility is about looking at the benefits of doing things, the results of doing things. So how would we measure that? In Agile, they talk about business value and being able to prioritize business value, but what they don't really do in Scrum and the other methods is actually give you a context for how you establish what that value is that you're supposed to measure. And that's where value agility comes in, which we'll talk about. The other aspect, and this is where they primarily focused in most of the Agile practices, is actually on delivery agility. So the assumption is that someone's already figured out, why you should be doing something. And Scrum and most other practices are focused on the delivery side about it, which gets you into how you actually do that. It gives you a means for doing that. Business agility is in the operational space. There's also cultural, client, leadership, agility. All of these things together comprise organizational agility, which is why I call it the 8 types. And back at the front there, the slide about myself that I didn't leave up much and talk about this time is referencing this in the sense that we're coming out with a series of books over the next year or so on each of these different types of agility. And we'll be doing webinars coming up on that as well. So what is value? Well, Simon Sinek, can start with why, defines it as perception. Money is a perfectly legitimate measurement of goods sold or services rendered, but it's not a calculation of value, because value is a feeling, it's perception. This is a very good book. It's one of the references that we have at the back of the presentation. So if you haven't read it already, it's definitely worth a read. It can give you some context to this. So if value is perception, then how do we shape perception? So how we kind of shape perception is by answering the following questions. Are we doing the right things? Are we getting the benefits from doing those things? Are we getting them done well? Are we getting them done in the right way? So those are strategic, value, delivery, and architectural questions, as you can see here. The strategic and value questions really are within the business domain. It's really the business that has to sort of drive that and create that view. The architecture and delivery questions are primarily technical. Now, when we're talking about business architecture, it's in the business domain, but it's the technical side of the business domain, which is why it's technical. Strategic and architecture help us figure out how we should organize ourselves because of setting strategic goals, strategic priorities. Value and delivery is how we should prioritize the work that we do in order to achieve those goals and objectives. This is the model from our book, and the model is broken into 4 quadrants: operate, innovate, prioritize, and co-create. And the essence of it is that the business operation team, once something is delivered into business operations, is when you can realize value and you can verify whether or not the value that's delivered, that's been realized, is actually what you're looking for, and whether your perception of it is that it meets what you intended. The innovate quadrant is, there's something typically in business operations that we would like to change, and this is usually where the genesis for projects come from. It's we're wanting to establish a new strategic direction because operations isn't sort of performing in the way that we'd like, or there's, we want to change our approach to things. So the innovate quadrant is where we get to define that new vision, new path to the future, new roadmaps, and so on. And that's where business leadership in that sense, it's all aspects of the business, not just the pure business lines, but it could involve marketing and HR and finance and IT and so on. So it's the entire business view of things about defining where we should go. The prioritize quadrant is the domain of the portfolio leadership team, which we'll explain in a couple of minutes, but this is where we get to prioritize the value from a delivery perspective and plan it out as to how we're actually going to go about it. Portfolio delivery teams focus on co-creating products and or services that are related to that value and delivering it back into business operations. And you'll notice in the diagram that on the outer rim is planning. The planning isn't aligned to the quadrants, which means that it's continuous planning, which is kind of a key ingredient of Agile thinking and Agile practices. The inner circle arrows are meant to indicate that we want to cycle through all 4 quadrants as quickly as possible. So as soon as we figure out that we want to change things, then we should be able to get something back into the hands of business as quickly as possible, at least some aspect of what we're intending to change. So it's this whole idea of incremental and iterative delivery of new things into business operations. Value and delivery agility. So value agility is about prioritizing and incrementally delivering value through individual product deliveries that are in line with an organization's strategic objectives and key stakeholder needs, which is what I mentioned a moment ago. It facilitates prioritization and planning, improved risk management, because of the fact that if we're doing things more iteratively and incrementally, then we're at less risk exposure because we're able to make adjustments. We're able to see things sooner back into business operations, so we're able to make adjustments. So our financial exposure is significantly less than if we're not delivering something back into operations for a year or more. It also allows for a simplified adaptive change. So as we're delivering and the business gets to see things, and I'll touch on this in a couple of minutes, they can say, I didn't realize we could do that. So now I can, maybe we should do this. If we can do that, maybe we should do this. Or, well, I know that's what we talked about. I know that's what I said we wanted. But now that I see it, I don't really think this is what we should be doing. We should be doing something else instead. So that's adaptive change. Delivery agility is about making the right choices in each of the product deliveries to support value delivery and the priorities we've set. So it goes from strategic priorities, prioritizing value, prioritizing within products. So in order to deliver a particular area, we may have to deliver multiple products. So you can have a strategic priority that can fan out into multiple sets of benefits organized by value categories or buckets, and within each of those you can have multiple products that are actually required to deliver on it. So there's a flow through on that. Delivery agility enables faster product development, higher levels of quality, all the things you hear about Agile. What are the characteristics? Well, if you look at value as being perception, then you realize that it is more than money, as Cynic says. But it means that it's now acceptable for the value statements themselves to be prioritized, which means they have to be clear and unambiguous, because you're actually going to define projects and portfolios and products based on those value statements. It means that the benefits can now also be stated and prioritized. And what all this sort of leads to, which is a bit of an interesting concept, and this is why the whole notion of perception enters into it, is that you don't have to actually deliver all the planned value for the clients, customers, business lines, whatever, to actually have a perception that value has been delivered. So we could have, a value delivery plan or view that sort of goes out over a couple of years of what we think we're going to do. But along the way, as we make these adjustments based on empirical observation and what we've delivered, we can choose not to do everything that we originally planned, and that's okay. And that's the whole point of this. It gives you these off-ramps to say, I've got enough, or this is no longer something of value because market conditions have changed, something has changed, and we don't need to do that anymore. And that's what this approach gives you. So what's the relevancy to project leadership? Well, for those of you who remember who this fellow is, he was Donald Rumsfeld, who was the U.S. Secretary of Defense during the first Gulf War. And during a press briefing, he, in talking about the vagaries and risks of war, he said, there are known knowns, known unknowns, and unknown unknowns. And it actually that sort of concept of these three things have some relevance to the project world. And typically, the known knowns are the things that we know we need to do, so we plan for them. So those are the planned things. And typically, what's referred to as the known unknowns are the things that we identify as potential risks, and we develop mitigation strategies for them. The unknown unknowns are things that they've never happened before. We could never have anticipated that they could happen. And, it's sort of the holy crap, what are we going to do now? We didn't expect that. But if you think about Agile and the notion of emergent architecture, emergent design, which is one of the sort of the key tenets of the principles in the Agile Manifesto, and you sort of look at that and say, well, what if we talked about emergence or thought of emergence as also in the nature of the problem that we're solving? So now if we look at these known unknowns or these unknown unknowns, and especially the unknown unknowns, then we get to this stage where we look at it and go, well, maybe we should actually do that. Maybe there's something in here that we should do. And this is sort of tying back to what I was saying about the strategic view. We can have this strategic vision, but once we actually get into execution, strategy execution, we start to realize that some of the things we thought may not be quite what we thought they were, or in solving this, we uncover new possibilities, new opportunities. And we should be open to being able to adapt to that. And what you see on the left here, this is a complexity scale, and the lower left, which you can't see, shows the simple things. The two sort of pinkish areas is the complicated, The one in the middle is um, uh, complex, I believe, and the outer one in yellow is chaos. And most traditional project management is based on the assumption that really all we're dealing with is in the simple and the complicated. But the reality of our world around us now and organizations that we work in is more and more things are chaotic, and really to a large extent we're operating at the edge, more at the edge of chaos than we are in the simple domain, and up in that space. And this is where value agility and strategic agility actually will benefit you the most if you understand it and start to practice it, because what it does is it allows you to start figuring out is, as things are changing on us all the time, because we're doing things in small increments, we're able to adjust much more quickly. So the cost of change or the cost of those adjustments actually are fairly low, and we're able to adapt to what we're now encountering. And that's a real key ingredient, because traditional project management is based on this notion that I can sit down, and do a plan for the next 2 years on project delivery. Good luck with that, because it typically doesn't work and hasn't worked for a very long time, because of this chaotic world we now live in and the projects that we have to execute. So what is Agile project leadership? Well, the first thing is that it's quite different than project management. And the main reason is because it's leadership-centric over management-centric, and that's because it's value-centric over deliverable-centric. When we do project plans in a traditional sense, we typically do a work breakdown structure, and work breakdown structures are against defined deliverables. But deliverables aren't necessarily related to value, and that's one of the real distinctions. So when you come at it from a value perspective, how you're delivering is always focused on what benefit does the business get if I do this, and the business can, because we're doing things iteratively and incrementally, the business can actually evaluate as to whether or not that is achieving what they expected. When we're building a product, in that process of building, a piece of software or a business process, we're using that value perspective to help us prioritize the things that we should do within the product and the sequence in which we should start delivering the increments to the business. In the waterfall traditional world, the scope or features are fixed, and it's the cost and schedule that gets estimated, and that's called plan-driven. Value-driven is where the cost and schedule are fixed and the features are estimated. They're negotiated over time. So typically what we do is we'll do something called an iteration or a sprint that can be anywhere from 1 week to 4 weeks. Typical duration is 2 weeks for a sprint. So we say, here's what we think we can do in this sprint, but that's part of an overall release plan for how we're going to deliver the particular product that belongs to. So if we don't deliver everything in the sprint that we intended, that's okay, because we're delivering according to highest priority first. And even if we don't do all the planned sprints, that's also okay, because we will have delivered the highest value things from the business perspective. So that's why the prioritization sort of trickles through all the way from strategic down to actual delivery. And that's a very different concept for a lot of people to get their heads around, is that the only thing I actually have to have a detailed plan on is what I'm doing in the next 2 weeks. I don't really need to see beyond that from a knowing the details perspective. And that's a real change in thinking and approach for people to overcome. The teams are constructed differently. So most people are, if you're familiar with Agile, especially in North America, then you would have been exposed to Scrum. So Scrum teams are typically 5 to 7 people working on a particular product. But what if, in order to achieve the business view of their priorities of what they want to do, you need to build multiple products. So you may need to stand up multiple teams of multiple project leadership groups, delivery teams, made up of multiple Scrum teams in each one. So the portfolio leadership team, what they do is they focus on value prioritization and delivery sequencing. So what's the order in which we should do things? The individual Scrum teams and the project delivery team project leaders, they focus on value delivery. So they're focused on the delivery agility side of things, the actual individual products and the portions of products being delivered incrementally. Now, what you're delivering, it can be software. It can also be business processes. And oftentimes, in order to deliver on an entire portfolio of things where you're transforming the business, it's more than just pieces of software. There's organizational changes. There's business process changes. There's all sorts of things that may need to happen to make that a success. The roles of the teams change. In traditional teams, people are typically into specialist roles like BAs, architects, designers, developers, and so on. Whereas in Agile teams, instead of being a specialist, you're a generalizing specialist. So you're very good at some things, but you know a lot of things, a lot of different things. So that's where also competency, in traditional competency is a role, whereas in Agile teams, competency is a personal contribution. Which is a very different view. So on any given day, a single person may be doing analysis and design and architecture and coding and testing. And that's okay. A lot of teams work that way and work very well that way. The team is contributing to value delivery versus a personal contribution to a deliverable, which is how traditional works. On Agile teams, everyone's a leader versus a PM manages the team. Another big difference is in terms of estimating, which in Agile, the team owns the estimates, and they're the ones who are committing to what actually can be done in a particular period of time, in a sprint. On traditional teams, it's the PM that drives it. So they're in the driver's seat for what the estimates are and trying to make sure that you're able to deliver to those estimates, which becomes quite challenging for them, if not impossible. The role for that person who's leading the team also changes. So you're now managing the system and not the people. In traditional project management, PMs have been called foremans, taskmasters, the slave driver, all those kinds of lovely terms. But in Agile teams, you're not managing the person, you're managing the system or the container in which work is happening. And you're pushing the responsibility down to the team to get things done. Removing impediments, bottlenecks that enable the teams and the organizations. Getting a shared understanding of the product, facilitating that. That's value-based over deliverables-based. So in Agile, we talk about the fact that the teams are the best ones to decide how and when to do things. And that's a real challenge for traditional project managers to overcome. They ask, but they don't tell, which is another important thing. Looking out for the whole. So although I said, in the next 2 weeks, you're only worried about what you're delivering in the next sprint, but the role of the project leader is to see the whole. And while the team is actually delivering, they're also seeing the whole as well, but in a bit of a smaller microcosm. Understanding the concepts of emergence and problem definition, architecture, and design. So not expecting to get these fully fleshed out deliverables up front before you actually start development. Knowing that these things are going to emerge as the solution emerges. Relying on transparent and visual tracking over status meeting and reporting. So if you've ever been involved in an Agile stand-up, people aren't reporting to anyone. They're just saying, here's where I'm at, here's my impediments. And when they say that, it's to the other people who are working with them because if they have an impediment, there may be someone else on the team who can help them. So it's more about making sure, based on what we've committed to do in that sprint, that we can actually do that and that we can stay focused on it. An Agile project leadership focus, obviously, it's focused on value delivery over plans and artifacts, adaptive action over change control, rolling release planning rather than entire scope up front, the idea of facilitative leadership. And the next one's really important, which is this notion of minimally viable. If you've read some things on Agile or if you've had some training, they'll talk about minimally viable product. But there's also the idea of minimally viable documentation, minimally viable processes. There's a common misconception that there's no documentation in Agile, and nothing could be further from the truth. It's just that you only do what you have to do. You don't do things that aren't required. The essential value delivery focused metrics. So back to, we're not looking for status reports. We're not looking for percent completes or anything like that. Is like, what did we expect to deliver in this sprint, and how close did we get to that? And making sure that if we're delivering the highest business value things, and if the business can see it, whether it's online in Scrum boards online or something, or Kanban boards online or something of the sort, or whether they can walk around and they can actually see the progression of things from, to do, in progress, done. So it's very visual. So you don't need to ask a PM about where we're at on a project and have these big status meetings to figure it out. Another thing which touched on before is for the project manager, moving to an Agile project leader, is you're no longer responsible for estimating. It's the team that does the estimates. And you're no longer doing one-time upfront planning. You're actually doing constant planning with the entire team. And this is quite significantly different in terms of the work you do and the way you approach it. A big thing in Agile, and this sort of goes back to the 7 types of agility, is that it requires it's heavily reliant on creating a shared vision. And if we have a shared vision, then we're able to create a shared understanding for why the project is being done. And if we have that, then we're able to create a cogent approach to what has to be done. So what are the things we should do? How will they be done? When will they be done? Who needs to be doing what, where? And that's the whole thing about the portfolio leadership team and figuring out value prioritization and value sequencing. So they're actually starting to figure out is what's the sequence in which we should do things, because we don't do everything at once. There has to be a pattern to how we deliver this. And that all comes from having a shared vision and a shared understanding. And one of the interesting things is, in traditional project management, one of the things we rely on is documents, because that's the primary deliverable. Is we deliver documents, we deliver requirements documents, we deliver design and architecture documents. And one of the fascinating things about that is that documents, next to emails, are 2 of the least valuable forms of communication between people. The most effective form is 2 people standing at a whiteboard and sorting something out, or a group standing at a whiteboard and sorting something out. So, that being said, point I made earlier, Agile doesn't mean no documentation, but what it doesn't mean is traditional documentation. Is we do only what's necessary, and we do it when we need to do it. So how do you become an Agile project leader? Well, thinking back to an earlier slide where we talked about the edge of chaos. So there's a lot of uncertainty that we encounter when we're doing projects. So it's all about discovery, so emergent discovery, and the choices we make as we discover things. How do we respond? How do we react to what we find? And this is sort of tied into 2 key concepts within Agile, these two here. And the first one is I'll know it when I see it. So what that means is it's only when something is actually built or delivered or is into a form where it can be shown or demoed to someone on the business side, a product owner or whatever, through a sprint review or a release review, is when they can actually see things for the first time and to be able to get a sense of what they're seeing is what they intended. And sometimes it's very difficult for them to be able to say exactly what they're getting at. So although even in Agile, you can go through all the exercise of creating the stories and the story maps and the themes and everything else, but it's only when they actually get their hands on it and can see it for real that they'll know if it's actually what they intended. So that's the whole thing of I'll know it when I see it. But what's also implied there is, and if I see it and I don't see what I'm looking for, that's a good thing too, because now we can make an adjustment. We're not that far along because we're able to see things more regularly. The other thing to it is being able to make that choice about you ain't going to need it, which is don't be putting in things that really aren't a priority. So that's the whole thing about how we prioritize business values. So starting from strategic priorities to value agility and establishing the benefits of things that we actually want to get to. So how do we prioritize those? And being careful not to start bringing forward things into an iteration or a sprint that are of much lower value than other things that haven't yet been done. And that's always a bit of a trade-off there with the business, but it's helping them understand that level of prioritization, that they should only do the highest priority things first. So traditional plan-driven versus value-driven. Discovery, highest value. Allocating budget to the highest value things first. Prioritizing based on business needs, business values. So that's around capabilities, and sequencing the return on value. Constant discovery and constant evolution. Incremental versus big bang deployment. So you build and deploy features in increments based on priority and value. And it means that's the whole focus to Agile is basically taking that approach. And by doing that, you get to make choices about perhaps you have enough value you can actually stop. Going back to our model, just wanted to highlight a couple of things that we've already talked about around the 4 quadrants. But where does Scrum actually occupy itself within this model? And it's shown here, and it's primarily from having a backlog of stories. We plan it, create it, test, and deliver features into release packages. They get sent to into a release, into a repository, get deployed to business operations. And that's the typical world of Scrum. So value agility is about, going from the business, I'd like to have something, to how fast we can get it back into operations or in our hands so we can see whether or not it's what we intend. So delivery agility is really about those two things, and Scrum is certainly a big facilitator of delivery agility. But it's important for us to understand that that's what it is, that it doesn't establish or create the other types of agility. It doesn't create the roadmaps. It doesn't help us prioritize things. It doesn't do portfolio management. It doesn't negate the need for project leadership. All of those things are still required. Agile project leaders, they understand the need to collaborate, to co-create. And what does that mean? Well, traditional project management, or traditional management for that matter, is premised on the notion of the individual and the intelligence of the individual. And over the years, it sort of manifested itself into, the idea of hiring the best and the brightest, the wisdom of the leader, the all-knowing, omnipotent leader, that was the entire focus on the individual. And what they now find is that, and there's a great book called The Wisdom of Crowds, which sort of talks about that, is the whole idea of collective intelligence, that we're actually much smarter as a group than we are as individuals. So that whole idea of me plus everyone else, the team, is really what's amazing in terms of what they can do. So that's all about collaborating to co-create. The other aspect of it, especially as a project leader, an Agile project leader, is, and even everybody else on the team, is noticing when things are missing, if we're not doing something that we should be doing, or there's something that we can improve, and bringing that to the team. That's the whole idea of everybody's a leader. It's not up to a single individual to be responsible for knowing everything and fixing everything. It's a group thing. Not always, sticking to the obvious, but also looking for things below the surface that can come back to haunt us later on if we don't notice it. And that again it's the whole team that should be open to doing that. If you have a strong opinion about something, one of the Agile is not an all sort of a kumbaya type atmosphere. It's the notion of creative conflict and constructive conflict is actually a good thing, and it's actually encouraged. In traditional projects, they tend to try and stay away from conflict, but in really mature Agile environments, they actually encourage it because if someone's got a strong opinion, there may be a very valid reason for why they have that perspective, and it's only when they get a chance to explain it that the others on the team may realize that there's actually something there that they need to consider. So allowing people to hold on to their stake and make their case is really what is one of the ways in which we can collaborate to co-create. Recognizing the fact that estimates are not facts. I throw these numbers in there so to sort of make the point, of precision. But in actual fact, what's the difference between saying something is going to cost that versus saying it's going to cost 1.342 million? We're being way too precise in our estimates. We don't actually know. What's the difference of saying 6 months versus what's there? What's the difference of saying 6 people or 7 people versus what's there? What's the difference, even in Agile, of using story points and saying it's 10 points? It's an estimate. And an estimate is just that. It's never a fact. It's only a fact when it becomes an actual. But an estimate is never a fact. So an estimate is our best guess, and we need to be able to adjust. And one of the interesting things is the further out in time that the estimate is applying to, the less uncertainty and the less accurate it gets. So, when you look at, when we're talking about all the details of everything we're going to do in the next 2 weeks, then we can actually have a fairly high degree of confidence of whether or not our estimates and the amount of work we think we can get done in that 2-week period is actually reasonably accurate. Is it 100% accurate? No, it never will be. It'll be reasonably accurate. It'll certainly be considerably more accurate than if we were trying to estimate that 2 weeks, 6 months in advance, or a year in advance. So Agile project leaders don't look at the team and go, well, you said it was only going to take 2 days, and now it's 3, and what's wrong with you, kind of thing. These are just estimates, and they should be treated as such. Using simple rules. So in Agile, we talk about a definition of done. So whatever a definition of done is, it has to be unambiguous, and it actually has to be doable. Focusing on the things that are minimally viable, so whether it's product, the processes, the documentation, whatever. And if we're going to add something to a process, then we should be asking what the value it brings and if it's worth those additional steps. Having release goals and sprint goals every single time, so the team knows what it's committing to. And at the end, and the client, the product owner, the business knows what they've committed to. So at the end, you have something to refer back to and say, well, here's what we committed to. Did we achieve? And if we didn't achieve, we can figure out why not, and we can make adjustments. Using a light touch. Typical project management, as I said, it's more of a taskmaster focus, whereas Agile project leadership, it's about leading versus managing. And it's also about recognizing and cultivating the autonomy of teams. And this is a really, really important concept. In Agile, we talk about self-managing, self-directing, which means the teams have to have a certain degree of autonomy for making decisions about the best way to do things. Being able to focus on value and on the customer, and as opposed to on deliverables and percent completes and that kind of thing. And that's a real mindset change. And what does that mean? Well, it means that decision-making is now shared. It's not the PM by themselves. Leading the flow of value delivery versus deliverables. Recognizing people as whole persons and treating them accordingly. And what that sort of refers to is over the years, one of the things that I observed personally on projects was that sometimes the best ideas and the most insightful comments actually came from the most inexperienced people on the teams. And the other part is, people come to work into a particular project with a whole lot of experience that they've gathered over the years at different places. We may bring them into a specific role, and this is one of the things we fall into in traditional project management, is because we see them in that role, then we see their competency as only being associated to the role. Whereas in an Agile team, competency is a contribution. So if they have competencies in other areas than their primary role, the team can benefit from that, and that's a really significant change. Focusing on the strengths over weaknesses, whether it's the individual and the team, in order to get the most out of them. Focusing on what people are really, really good at, or what teams are really, really good at, means we can actually achieve a lot more than we focus on what they can't do. Practicing adaptive leadership, which means back to the whole thing of operating at the edge of chaos, is we adjust to what we now know that we didn't know previously. It's only through doing that we find it out. We track and monitor project value delivery. We help the teams apply agile practices, and this is a really significant change because before, PMs really didn't see themselves very much in the role of coaching and mentoring the people on their teams. And in the agile world, that's an expectation that if you have this role, then your role is to help to coach and mentor the teams. Learning and adapting continuously. So at the end of every sprint or release, we do retrospectives. In traditional project management, we'll do a lessons learned, which years ago I started referring to as lessons lost because we never really did anything about it. Whereas in Agile, with these retrospectives every couple of weeks, we get to make adjustments in the next sprint. We get to apply what we said we want to change and see if we can make things better. The other thing is about embodying leadership that inspires and energizes the team. So you're a bit of a cheerleader as well for the team itself. Getting team feedback daily through stand-ups, scrums, through information radiators. Using appropriate metrics, so measuring value delivery, not deliverables or time spent. So here's the highest business priority things we said we should be doing in this sprint, and what we're trying to do as a team is to make sure we deliver on those priorities. Don't compare velocity of delivery across teams. Every team is unique. Every team has a different composition of skills, cultures, backgrounds, and everything else. So we can't really look at one team as compared to another and wonder why they're not able to produce at the same rate. If a team has been together for a very long time, over time, if you see teams that get to stay together, and this is one of the real tenets of Agile, again, is that teams that stay together, is if they do get to stay together over long periods of time, you'll actually start to see a fairly close capability and delivery across the teams when that happens. Tracking escape defects, and basically what that means is if our goal is to, if it's a software thing, so if our goal is to deliver defect-free software, high-quality software, then if defects do escape into production, we should be assessing the reasons for it, making the improvements to stop that, from happening again, and then measuring and seeing if we actually were able to reduce the number of defects. So the last thing I'll leave you with is, and this is again at a leadership level, is every time we're doing a review, so every 2 weeks, or at the end of a release, if we're not releasing in 2 weeks, if we use multiple sprints for a particular release, do we stay on the track that we're on, or do we adjust the track? And sometimes, and this goes back to the whole notion of emergence, both in problem solving, architecture, and design, is we may have been going down a particular path, but we may discover that conditions have changed and we need to adjust, or what we thought we could do is actually not possible, so we need to adjust. And that's one of the real benefits of Agile is we get to think that way, and we have the benefit of that thinking. And as a result, it's okay for the team, the project leader, the portfolio leader, the business leader to say, I missed it by that much. And that's not considered a negative. It's actually considered a positive, because the whole idea of, if something is not working, or if it's the wrong decision, the wrong thing to be doing, is, we can stop it at any time. After any 2-week block of work, or 1 week, whatever our iterations are, that gives us an opportunity to stop doing the wrong thing. Whereas in traditional project management, typically it's only at near the very end where those types of decisions are made, or it actually gets delivered and it never gets deployed. It never goes into production. Whereas in Agile, we get to make those adjustments in much shorter shrift, which is obviously a very good thing. So what we've talked about over the course of the last hour or so is the fact that, Agile project leadership is really all about facilitation. Processes are important. They do enable what we do. But we need to look at our processes from the perspective of they should be minimally viable. So really, it's not about the process. It's more about, just making sure we're doing the right things at the right time in the right way to achieve the right benefits. And the last piece of that is that it really is all about the people and the teams, and how we structure them, how we support them, how we enable them, how we facilitate them, and realizing that, it's only when we have high-performing teams that we can actually achieve high performance as organizations. And that's really what agility is all about. I've included some references. Obviously, one of them is our book, which will be providing a link to all of the attendees, so you can download it, a free download. There's a couple of others there as well that you may find of interest. Here's my personal contact information, so you're free to follow me on Twitter, connect with me on LinkedIn. You can send me emails directly. You can call me. As I mentioned, CTE and Train Canada, we're partners. We do all of the Agile training, so if you're a government agency, they're on the government standing offers for getting access to our training and stuff. Check them out. Okay, so I'd like to thank everybody for attending. I hope you found it useful. I hope you will enjoy the book, and hope to do this again soon. Thank you.